Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy. Today I'm going to do a short video on the topic of how rapiers were carried or worn on a day-to-day basis and how they were drawn for combat when a fight started. The reason this is an important topic is because there are many critics of the rapier, both in the historical period and in modern day, who say that the rapiers were too long to be practical, that you couldn't draw them easily or couldn't draw them from your belt at all, and therefore they were kind of useless weapons for a real fight. But I want to put forward the idea that this is in fact nonsense, that rapiers were extremely practical weapons and that you could wear them on a day-to-day basis and you could use them in a street fight or in a military skirmish or whatever situation you could imagine. The first piece of evidence for this is just the fact that rapiers were carried and worn by all sorts of people across Western Europe for a good 150 years or more. No one would carry these weapons if you couldn't really use them. And they were carried in civilian and in military contexts, and you can see very, very good and accurate representations of this in many period artworks from the late 16th and 17th centuries. However, we can also get more specific technical information about this from a few different fencing treatises. My normal source, Di Grassi, talks about this only briefly, but Angelo Vigiani and Ridolfo Capoferro both give pretty detailed descriptions of how the rapier was drawn for combat. Vigiani's treatise is a little bit closer in terms of publication date to Di Grassi, so I'm going to primarily be relying on what he has to say. Okay, so that's kind of the introductory preamble out the road. So let's proceed to a practical demonstration. I shall be right back with my rapier. Okay, so here I am with one of my training rapiers ready for a demonstration. This rapier has a blade length of roughly 108 or 109 centimeters, which is very typical for Italian swords of the late 16th and early 17th century. That measurement is from cross to tip, well over a meter long, exactly the sort of weapon that critics say is too long to be practical in a real fight. Okay, so this criticism would have some merit if the sword was worn tucked through the belt at waist height, as some other sidearm type swords were. However, the rapier was not carried that way. It was actually worn suspended in one of these. This is a sword hanger. So it's a system of straps suspending the weapon down at more or less mid-thigh height. Back in the day, the blade would of course be protected by a leather scabbard as well. Unfortunately, I don't have one for this sword, but it's not really relevant for today's demonstration. The scabbard would simply clip to the inside of the sword hanger arrangement. So it doesn't really make any difference to drawing the sword itself. The hanger is the key point. So I'll just set up my weapon. And there we go. Okay, so the principles of drawing the rapier. Here it is, swinging from the sword hanger, mid-thigh height. Both hands are going to be active in drawing the sword. They're going to pull in opposite directions. The hanger itself is able to swing a little bit, so this mobility is important. The weapon's going to be drawn across the body with an expansion of the chest. And the whole movement is going to be supported and stabilized by taking a little step with one of the feet. Usually you step forwards with the lead foot, but it would be possible to step backwards with the offside foot as well, if you preferred. The end point of the rapier draw is specifically described in both Di Grassi and Vigiani, and in fact in Capoferro as well, as being the high ward or high guard, or in Capoferro's terms, prima guardia position. So in other words, you're drawing so that the sword is directly above the lead shoulder with the tip presented more or less at the face of the opponent. So let me show you what I'm talking about. We're in a casual stance, a fight's about to start, our offhand goes to stabilize the sword hanger, our sword hand goes over the handle or grip of the sword, leading with the forefinger. I then pull back with the left hand and forwards with the right hand and take a step forwards. And the chest expands to support that, and the end point is high ward. And of course you can bring the offhand forwards to help cover the space as well. So let me just reset the sword and I'll show you that facing in the other direction, which is a bit more useful. So I'm in my casual stance, offhand stabilizes the hanger, sword hand takes the grip, I draw and step, finishing in high ward. So if you are wearing the rapier in the correct way and you were trained to draw it correctly, it's actually very little effort at all. It takes less than a second from the point you get your hand on the handle of the sword. So stabilize, hand on sword, and drop. Very fast. In theory, that drawing action could even be a kind of deflection or parry if necessary, and otherwise you're presenting the tip of the sword ready for an immediate imbroccata thrust if your opponent is within measure to do so. So it's actually got a little bit of versatility as well. Now the last criticism I want to address about the rapier itself is space. So you can draw it quickly, but isn't it a bit clumsy for use in a confined space? Let's do an experiment. So I'll use this chair to provide a little bit of an obstacle. So I'm going to leave it there. I would say that's maybe about 1 meter in front of me, more or less, maybe slightly less. Let's see how it goes. So hand on the sword hanger, sword hand to the grip. There we go. So the tip cleared the chair. Let me show you that once again. Casual stance, left hand to hanger, right hand to grip, draw. So from the moment you get your hand to the grip of your sword, it takes about less than 1 second, I would say, to draw it, and you need a little bit less than 1 meter's clearance in order to do so, if the rapier is worn correctly and if you are trained to draw it correctly. If you're in a really confined space, then you may not have the time or space to draw the rapier, but that's the very reason why people carry daggers as a backup weapon. And I'll just pause there and go and get one of my daggers just to complete the demonstration for you. I will be right back. Okay, so here we go. This is one of my daggers. This is a really big dagger. This is probably as long as a dagger would get. So, as most of you probably know, the rapier and dagger was a favoured combination, and serious swordsmen would probably carry both weapons. So the dagger is actually worn tucked in the small of the back with the handle at the left-hand side if you're a right-handed swordsman. So it would be tucked directly into the sword belt. It may have its own scabbard, in which case the whole thing would be tucked into the sword belt. So the arrangement would look something like this. So the dagger can easily be drawn left-handed for use as an offhand weapon. Or if it was necessary to use the dagger as a primary weapon due to confined space, it could easily be drawn from around there with the right hand as well. So there you go, that's the setup for a rapierist. Your sword is carried in the hanger and your dagger is carried tucked in the sword belt like so. And you are very much ready for combat, ready for trouble. So that's as much as I want to say. I hope that helps to dispel the myth that the rapier was an impractical weapon, that it couldn't be used in the sudden heat of combat. That is nonsense. And in fact, it was a very practical and deadly weapon indeed. And if your opponent was very, very close, you can always use the dagger on them instead. That's all for today. Take care, everyone. I will see you next time. Bye for now.